Welcome to the GSMC Business News Podcast, the show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. If you're looking for a podcast to keep you informed and ahead of the game in business, the GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Welcome to the GSMC Business News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Paula DuPont, and today we've got several key topics to talk about. First, let's just say we're coming off of Memorial Day weekend, a time when a lot of us look forward to kind of starting the summer, the unofficial start of summer, and I think there was a lot of angst going into this holiday, wondering how people were going to continue practicing social distancing and observing the rules around being together, and also being able to enjoy some of the public spaces and beaches and things that in a lot of states opened up just prior to or in time for the Memorial Day weekend. So this being a Tuesday, we don't have any economic data about how the weekend went, but there's an awful lot of anecdotal ideas about how it went, judging by pictures that have come out showing small group gatherings with people wearing masks and staying apart. And then you have other pictures of pools that are crowded with just teeming with people. In fact, more so than you might expect in a public pool or even a private pool for that matter, without a pandemic going on. So, it can, taken out of context, it can look alarming and look like a lot of people are ignoring the rules. But, that's just literally a snapshot of one particular event. Again, we don't have a lot of data yet, but it sounds like in terms of parades and other public events that might have otherwise happened any other year on Memorial Day, a lot of those moved to online activities that happened. So I guess overall, I think a lot of people are very nervous, but at the same time have been very anxious to get out there and to enjoy the outside, as well as, a decent barbecue. So hopefully we didn't pick up more cases of COVID because of these activities this past weekend. So going forward, where we are, we're still at the end of May, still into the second quarter of the year. And we're going to talk today about the impact of the virus on businesses that have already been running. We're going to talk about businesses that are getting ready to open, or companies that are getting ready to welcome people back, and some that are just starting actually today. We're also going to talk a little bit about the mortgage situation. This is kind of a follow-up to a previous podcast where we talked about the fact that there's a lot of new activity in terms of mortgages. Today's news reflects that it, may be pulling back a little bit. So we're going to talk a little more about that and a couple other things. So we're going to get started in just a moment. I have to admit that as I look at the business news every day, I am looking for the positive stories. They're a little harder to find. Often they're buried, and sometimes they try to make something positive out of something very, very small. But let's face it, we need any sign that we can get that things are improving the economy as well as our overall morale in this country and the world, I guess, for that matter. But, as I said, there's plenty of negative stories out there, and that is the reality of the situation. And it's important to understand that so that we can all, make our decisions and try to continue on bearing that in mind. Perhaps it makes it a little easier to handle some of the hard times, knowing that we're not alone and that this is really affecting the whole country. But as I said, I do gravitate towards more positive stories. And there's one that I saw that kind of looked at some smaller signs that the economy is beginning to improve, at least in some areas. It's, of course, we're still in May, and right now we're expecting that the numbers coming out of May probably won't be a whole lot better than April in terms of consumer spending, in terms of jobs. We know that obviously we're in double digits right now with the jobless rate. So we're still in it, and of course we have a lot of those things that we still have to work through. It's also expected, by the way, that the economy for the year is supposed to contract by 6 to 7%. So we know even over the course of the year that we're still going to be having some pain. But as I said, there are some little positive signs that we need to look at. First of all, truckloads are growing. So the major companies that do a lot of the transporting of goods throughout the country, they have been growing, which is a sign that there's more activity. You have air travel and hotel reservations are up slightly. Again, nowhere near where it was a year ago or pre-pandemic this year, but still a sign that things are moving in a positive direction rather than a further negative direction. You have, in terms of, as I said about the airlines and some indicators that suggest that we're getting a little more comfortable with the idea of traveling, is that the number of travelers passing through airport security screening checkpoints totaled 87,534 on April 14th, which is still way below, almost 100% below that same day last year. But by this past Sunday, the figure had more than tripled to 267,451 traveling through airport security. So that gives an idea, that triple figure of obviously some improvement, people getting more comfortable with travel. And also, obviously we have to throw credit to the airlines themselves for starting to, put into place practices that make it a little more attractive to consumers that are feeling pretty nervous about, flying in a tightly spaced aircraft. So as we know, a lot of airlines are taking a lot of measures to increase cleaning, not book every seat, enforce the use of masks. So again, that's a positive sign. And overall, the fact that more states have opened up for business to some degree, obviously in some places more than others. In fact, I believe all 50 states have opened up in some way, shape, or form just recently. Once you have this opening up, we're going to begin to see more consumer spending, which accounts for about 2/3 of the U.S. economic output. So when we can get consumer spending going and get that stimulated, we can expect to see a lot more improvement. Another indicator that things are improving is some statistics that come from truckstop.com, which measures demand in trucking spot market. And they reported that for 4 straight weeks, that available loads were up 27% by the week ending May 18th. So the fact that that's up 27% reflects a lot more activity, obviously. One other indicator worth mentioning is that showings of real estate properties have gone up. Now, you would expect typically in the spring that there would be more home buying activity, thus showings. And of course, with the pandemic and the restrictions around social distancing, real estate market has really been hindered by not being able to show properties. But at this point, they've started doing that, and they're actually home showings overall in 100 of the top markets was up 27% as of May 24th. So that's a good sign. So as I said, there's a lot to look at here, and there are other things as well. In fact, in the next segment after this commercial, I'm going to talk about some businesses that are actually hiring, which is obviously the best sign yet.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Are you looking for a podcast that gives you all of the latest news from the world of finance? Then check out the GSMC Financial News Podcast. We'll delve into the ups and downs of the stock market, changes in the economy, and news from the world of real estate and technology. From breaking news on the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, or the overseas market, to updates on the bond market, if there's money to be made, we'll cover it on the GSMC Financial News Podcast.
I mentioned in the last segment that, of course, one of the best indicators that things are starting to recover or get better is new jobs. And, unfortunately, in a time where across the country we're about at 15% jobless rate, which is, I don't know if it's totally unprecedented, but it's certainly... we haven't been here in a long time. And in some places like California, I believe it's even closer to 20% jobless rate. So that's a pretty big figure when you think about it. And the areas that, we're still waiting to see if companies are going to be bringing back the same amount of employees once they're opened up and resume to normal operations, or bringing people back into offices or factories, if they're going to do that. And that's just going to be a wait and see kind of thing. I don't think we really know for sure how many of those jobs will come back. Of course, that's part of what's behind the PPP stimulus package, was to provide loans to businesses with some assurances that they would keep people on the payroll or bring them back once they're able to be operational. So with that said, all the kind of caveats to this, it's still important to note that there are some areas where there are jobs and there is some growth. Just, defense contractors, for one, they have continued working throughout the pandemic because they're considered essential. And companies like Lockheed Martin, which is a huge defense contractor, in fact, I believe it's the biggest military contractor, they have hired more than 1,000 new workers in recent weeks, and apparently are advertising for another 5,000 open positions. So that's pretty encouraging on that level. And you have other industries, as I said, in general, that are hiring. Warehouse clubs and super centers are probably one of the bigger areas where they're hiring. And you can see where there's the need for that. We've been hearing about that, like for Amazon in their warehouse. But this is actually more like Sam's Clubs and BJ's and Costco, places like that where they are hiring. And that's probably one of the biggest areas that are biggest industries that's hiring. Central banks are also hiring. Computer equipment manufacturers, couriers and messengers, information services, and the U.S. Postal Service, believe it or not. So, some of these jobs are, security guards, senior care professionals, online banking services, and landscaping. Those are other ones that, are continuing to look for more people and have been needed all the while we've been in this lockdown. But it is encouraging, at least, to see that there are some areas that are still hiring. Now we're going to switch attention to companies that are getting ready to come back and bring their employees back, those who've been working at home and perhaps those who've been furloughed. And we know that there are a lot of companies, and they've been trying to figure out ways that they're going to test people as they come back. And of course, that's the big key, is being able to test employees coming back to protect each other, and also visitors to institutions and places for work, and making sure that they're not bringing the virus in with them. Some of the challenges that companies face in making these plans is the fact that even if they do test everybody, there's a 72-hour timetable for getting results. So that becomes an issue to plan for. You have companies that work across the country, in different states where there are different rules around reopening business. So companies have to face how they're going to navigate policies throughout the country, and globally as well, if they do serve a global base. They're also trying to figure out who do they test, how often do they test, and tests aren't cheap. They're about $100 a test to administer them. So it's a big consideration when you have a pretty large work. Some companies have opted not to test everyone, but only those who are symptomatic. And in fact, several large companies are using some type of screening procedure, an app, or some other way of trying to get a sense of an employee's exposure and their risk and the likeliness that they may have come in contact with the virus. This, of course, presents other issues in terms of privacy and how much a company can ask a person about their personal health. So there are some companies that are not using screening procedures like that because of that privacy issue. But others who are using it will use an app and a questionnaire and determine, based on the results of the questionnaire, whether or not someone should be tested. And that's how they're handling who gets the test. And of course, and one example of that, by the way, is United Health and also Microsoft Corporation. They both have developed or jointly worked together to develop an app that checks workers' symptoms and gives a go-ahead to report to work. The app will also determine if someone seems that they may have symptoms or could be at risk to take the test, and they will order them to do that. As I started to say before, one of the biggest issues for companies is having something that's a more rapid response kind of test, because as you know, in 72 hours, you could have someone exposing others to the virus if they don't have the results. As it turns out, there is a company that does do rapid testing. I believe it's Abbott Laboratories and Cepheid. Both those companies have machines that can deliver test results in 45 minutes or less, but those are primarily deployed to healthcare system workers. So without that, the companies are still facing that other challenge of timing. So we are going to take another quick commercial break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the New York Stock Exchange and it opening for business today.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
this segment, we're going to talk about the New York Stock Exchange floor reopening. Not the stock exchange itself, because that's already been open all during this lockdown, but the actual floor where they had sent people home. But before we do that, I thought it was probably important to note some other news that came out relative to testing. We were just talking about testing in the last segment. And recently, in the city of Wuhan in China, where there are 11 million people, the government had decided to do testing of all 11 million people. And they had planned to do that in a 10-day time span. They did this because they wanted to, they had some recent cases show up, and they wanted to get a sense of where it was and to try to obviously contain that. And what they did, which most people thought was pretty ambitious and near impossible to get 11 million people, they actually got 9. They got 9 million people. And last Friday, in fact, they had tested 1.47 million people in one day. And that's more than 3 times the number of the busiest day of testing in the United States. So that gives you an idea. Now, of course, some things are more possible in China because of the way the government works, and it's very persuasive way of making testing happen. But you know, still, it shows what's possible, I guess, if you have the resources and you have all the people to do it. One of the other interesting things is that they use a method in developing the results of the test called sample pooling. And what they do is they'll take 5 to 10 samples at once and use in a single test. So they can take a group of people, basically run the results, and if they're negative, then they know that group was negative. Now, of course, if it should come up positive, there isn't a way to know who specifically within that pool is the one that has it. But I guess when you have a pretty good sense that the majority of the public is not infected, it's probably a good way to go, and it gets you results faster. Now, as for the results of that testing, it appears that based on the 10 days of testing millions of people, that overall there were no more than 3 dozen asymptomatic cases from the hundreds of thousands of tests conducted each day. So overall, the results were largely good. I won't say positive because that means they were infected, but you know, it's just something to consider again as we look at testing and how effective it could be. So in terms of the New York Stock Exchange and its floor reopening today, it's actually going to be a modest reopening, or is a modest reopening. Only 1/4 of the New York Stock Exchange's usual population of traders is expected to be back today. The stock exchange floor has been closed for 2 months during the lockdown. Of course, traders have been working online, and most of the activities, nearly all the activities, were taking place online from remote locations. With opening up, they knew that they had to, the exchange knew that they had to change some practices. So they have said that traders who return must wear masks, avoid taking public transportation, and follow social distancing rules. They have plexiglass barriers to keep them apart from each other. And they have also, because of this, they have also banned visitors to the stock exchange floor. So that means that some of the bell ringings that they would have to start or end the day on the stock exchange floor, to announce a new IPO or whatever that, mark some specific milestone, they're not doing that. So they have banned visitors from the stock exchange floor. And in fact, media organizations that have broadcast from the floor in the past, like CNBC and Cheddar, they aren't permitted back either. So one of the other things that they had to do was to, those coming back, the traders coming back, had to sign a liability waiver that prevents them from suing the stock exchange if they get infected or if they should bring the virus home to their families. And that itself has raised some controversy among some of the companies that work there. Now, see, the companies that work there, the traders that go there, aren't necessarily stock exchange employees. They work for different trading firms. And so some have opted to not go back, either because of the waiver or for their own reasons, have not gone back and continue to do their work online. In fact, Morgan Stanley is one of them, the big brokerages, that's not returning to the stock exchange right now. And again, to clarify, the stock exchange floor, they are still obviously trading in the stock exchange. But it's interesting to see how one company handles bringing back people that are in what would typically be very interactive kind of roles, the way traders work with each other. And they are not doing the kinds of yelling, screaming transactions with a trader to buy shares, at the different points that they used to. And of course, with the fact that they are required to wear face masks means that they can't eat at all on the stock exchange floor. They have to go to designated areas or to the cafeteria so that they can ensure people are keeping their masks on at all times. So we are going to take another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about companies who have already been open for business and some of the challenges that they have faced in terms of costs and the cost to operate during a pandemic. And more on that just after this commercial.
Hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
I think I can safely say that most of us have been pretty grateful for the businesses that have remained open during the pandemic shutdown, lockdown. Some of them, of course, have been required and are essential, I guess, in fact, all of them are essential in some way, shape, or form. It varies, of course, by the state of what certain things are considered essential. When it comes to healthcare workers, naturally, they're among the top businesses or people that we admire and we're grateful for their efforts, especially putting themselves at risk to do what they're doing. And it's no surprise that for them, hospital workers, healthcare workers, as well as those who work in grocery stores or that deliver or work in factories that have remained open because of being essential, that we know that a lot of them have been doing their job at great risk. But the business owners also have been having to pay a lot more to keep their businesses going, even though they're grateful to be in business and doing what they're doing. It does come with a cost. And recently I saw an article that talked about how much this is costing businesses. Some of the things that businesses are facing are higher costs to keep workers and customers safe, which makes sense. I mean, they have to take efforts like putting up plexiglass, limiting capacity, making sure that people are safely apart when they're lined up to pick up something at their business or if they have to go in somewhere. So in order to do that, it has it has cost companies something, and some of them has meant that the businesses themselves, small businesses in particular, are cutting services and jobs in order to make up for what they need to pay to survive otherwise. Walmart, Target, and Home Depot are three large companies that recently said that they absorbed more than $2 billion combined in added expenses for wages and bonuses and other benefits for their workers during the early months of the pandemic. As you know, some of those companies have had to increase what they were paying their frontline workers in order to keep them on the job and to incent them to continue coming in. McDonald's, they had laid out conditions for their franchisees to reopen their dining rooms that include cleaning bathrooms every half hour and digital kiosks after every order. Ford Ford Motor Company had also opened its assembly plants for the first time in 2 months, but they had to idle them, both in Michigan and Illinois, after employees tested positive for COVID-19. The cost-revenue ratio is very much out of whack for these businesses because of these added expenses. The restaurant industry has been faced with some of its own challenges, obviously, in transitioning to a takeout or curbside pickup kind of business. And a lot of them have limited their menu items to those that are probably easier to prepare, faster to prepare, and where the ingredients are more readily available. And I'm not even addressing the whole meat shortage issue and what impact that may have had on restaurants. But just in terms of the additional costs that they have to take on to keep their kitchens running and to be able to staff the takeouts and deliveries. Some companies, some restaurants have actually added a surcharge onto their bills, and some customers have been okay with it. Other customers not so much. That's something that the different restaurants are experimenting with. And some have just simply raised the prices on their menu items from what they were before. I think in the beginning of all this, a lot of restaurants were getting some consideration from consumers who would try to tip better or tip at all when maybe they wouldn't ordinarily for takeout. But people have tried to support them. I don't know that that has still been able to sustain them in terms of the prices. I suspect not. Which is why, again, a lot of them have had to increase the menu prices. And, whether or not that returns back to pre-pandemic pricing once they get back on their feet and the restaurants open, that's unclear. Because then again, you still have the issue of the increased costs involved in keeping their dining rooms socially distant and limiting their capacity, and the additional costs for cleaning their restroom facilities. Another area where they've had to change their pricing strategy is in package delivery, with like UPS, the United States Postal Service, FedEx, DHL Express. A lot of them, not the U.S. Postal Service, but a lot of them have had to implement surcharges for international shipping during this time. DHL Express has said that its costs have risen in part because cargo space it buys on commercial airliners has now become more scarce because of so many flights being canceled. UPS has been applying a fee it calls a peak surcharge on international shipments, and they've been doing this since April. So clearly a lot of businesses have been impacted by increased costs, and again, the healthcare industry, particularly the smaller health systems that aren't part of a larger corporation that might otherwise be able to absorb some of the additional costs involved. The smaller healthcare organizations are struggling because a lot of them have obviously had to eliminate or at least postpone elective surgeries and other services that they would have otherwise provided during this time. So obviously they don't have those billings to draw from. So there is a cost involved in staying open, and you're darned if you do and you're darned if you don't, right? As we talked about in the previous segment, companies getting ready to open and looking at what they need to do and the cost considerations to assure worker safety. There's a lot to consider, but bottom line is, if you're going to be open, there's going to be an additional cost to doing business, at least for a while. So we are going to take another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some recent information about mortgages. That's sort of a follow-on to some earlier discussions on podcasts about the mortgage industry and how that's doing. So more on that in just a moment.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
When it comes to home buying and the housing market, there have been some recent signals that suggest it's improving and starting to return. Obviously, not where it would have been a year ago, but approaching that. And given the fact that spring is one of the big times for people to buy new homes so they can move and be situated before the fall start of the school year, this is, it's not surprising that activity would be up a little bit this time of year. It is surprising in terms of how everything has been been stagnant and on hold because of this pandemic. Last week in a podcast, I talked about some of the positive signs. The fact that mortgage applications have increased. And in fact, the purchase volume has been 1.5% lower than a year ago. Now, I'm saying lower, but really when you consider where we've been, just being a percentage point or so less than where we were a year ago is not bad. Mortgage applications to purchase a home have risen by 6% in recent weeks from where they were before. Buyers are coming back to the housing market far faster than anticipated, despite the lockdown. In terms of refinancing, however, there aren't as many applications for that, according to some of the information that I saw last week. Lower rates, however, are probably one of the biggest contributors to more mortgage applications. Mortgage interest rates have been at a record low, thanks mostly in part to the Federal Reserve decreasing the federal interest rate, and then that, of course, triggering banks and lending organizations to lower their interest rates. The problem, though, and what the recent news article that I saw indicates, is that also because of COVID and the impact, not as many people are getting approved for mortgages. The rules are tightening up. So although applications are higher and at least indicates more of a willingness to buy, the rules around who gets approved for a mortgage is a whole other story. With so many people out of work and this uncertainty about the future and the future of the job market, lenders are imposing tougher income and credit score requirements for mortgage approval. And also, they're looking for better down payment down payments that applicants can make. So it's like a double-edged sword. You have, in order to get the economy stimulated, you want people buying homes and taking advantage of these low interest rates, which is the reason that the Fed, or one of the reasons why the Fed lowered it to begin with, was to incent this kind of activity. However, you have the negative effects on the job market affecting mortgage approval. Another factor affecting the change in criteria for mortgage approval is that the economic factors have been exacerbated by policy decisions in Washington. As part of the March stimulus bill that Congress passed, they let homeowners suspend mortgage payments for up to a year. But Congress did not provide a way to pay for this. So that potentially can saddle lenders with the burden. So there again is a reason why lenders are trying to better protect themselves, because that other wave may be coming. Another indicator where mortgage rates are being affected is the fact that mortgages for jumbo loans, what they call jumbo loans, which is for the large houses, the McMansions, that don't get government backing. And these are loans that would be, more than $500,000. Because of that, that's also affecting overall the mortgage market when you don't have those loans as part of it. It's interesting, though, that something I learned last week was that some of the big real estate firms are seeing an interest in the McMansions again and some of the higher priced homes. Some of that due to the, I guess, urban sprawl, or actually the effect of remote workers for big tech companies not returning back to the office in the more urban areas where their offices are located, but are opting to work from home. And so in doing so, home is more important, and now they want offices and more space. So they are buying bigger properties in the suburbs. So it's kind of an interesting trend. I guess overall, the other discouraging factor in terms of mortgages is that because of the CARES Act that Congress had passed, homeowners whose loans are backed by Fannie, Freddie, and the Federal Housing Administration, as well as the Veterans Administration, allowed some homeowners to suspend payments for up to a year, even without them giving proof that they had a hardship. And apparently, because of that provision, 4.75 million people had decided to opt for that, to suspend payments. So that's about $1 trillion of unpaid principal that still has to be rectified with. So I know that's not a great story to end on, and that's why I'm going to end on something completely different. In the next segment after this commercial break, we're going to talk about something that might be good news to some people and bad news to others, but not bad in the way we've been talking about mortgages and some of the other dire things. I'm really kind of saying that lightly. But I promise this is a much lighter news article to talk about.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Well, it's a sad day for all of us, I think. Crocs, the company that makes the plastic foam-like shoes, is actually thriving right now because of the pandemic. Their sales have gone through the roof. And in an article that I saw that, is kind of like an accident that you have to stop and look at, they actually are saying that now they're cool, that Crocs are cool. I mean, to me, this is sort of akin to, I think it was a Seinfeld episode where George Costanza is wearing sweatpants and Jerry or Elaine say something like, "Isn't that just giving up?" And I kind of feel that way about Crocs. But apparently, a lot of people feel differently. This article said that, despite the fact that the company has struggled a bit with its identity as being kind of silly and ugly, and of course that's in the eyes of the beholder, but there are a lot of people that do feel that way. It struggled with that and hasn't necessarily rebranded itself, but has come up with some cool partners that are helping, I guess, to change the image of them. Crocs evidently is the only footwear brand among 30 others that were tracked by a group of researchers at NPD Group. Crocs was the only one to record sales growth in March, a 14% increase compared with the same month in 2019. Go figure. It was one of the top two companies, along with sheepskin bootmaker UGG, to log growth in April, a month when many stores were closed. Last month, search interest on Google for Crocs reached a 15-year high, and Amazon has now returned them to their bestseller list. What is going on? Sorry, that's not in the article. That's my inner voice coming out. The brand Crocs has reached a record $1.23 billion in revenue last year. And that's more than a decade after the shoes first went into business. I mentioned earlier that the brand had partnered or is partnering with some celebrities in order to try to change the image of the shoe. One of them is rapper Post Malone. And apparently when his Croc shoes are made available, they often sell out within hours, with tens of thousands of pairs being sold. That really surprised me. I did not think that the Post Malone fan would also be a Croc fan. The band Kiss is another one that they've partnered with, along with designers Vera Bradley and Vivian Tam. The company has also recruited celebrities like actress Zooey Deschanel and Natalie Dormer to be brand ambassadors. I haven't seen any commercials or anything on that, but I guess that's coming, or maybe that's just through social media that they're donning their Crocs. Crocs got its mojo back by embracing its signature style of being easy to clean, easy on, easy off, comfortable, colorful. They had opened several stores throughout the country to sell them. However, they closed many of them, and they just turned to selling them on Amazon and Tmall and other online sellers. They have also sold these gibbets charms, which are little plastic charms that fit in the holes on the shoe. If you're familiar with the design, they have holes, I guess, to aerate the foot on the top of the shoe, and also along the band, I believe, that goes around the ankle. And gibbets charms can cost about $4 each, and Crocs themselves are about $45. So if people decide that they want to plug in all the holes with the gibbets, they could probably spend more on the gibbets than they would on the shoes themselves. So I suppose this is a very happy occasion for Croc wearers and those who have a vested interest in the company's success. Power to you. I don't know then if that's going to be something that will be considered as part of a company's re-entering the workplace policy, if people will be allowed to wear their Crocs into the office. It might be another incentive for companies to allow employees to continue working from home so that they can wear their Crocs at home and not bring that into the work environment. As I said earlier in this podcast, managers at companies who are looking at how to come back and reintegrate employees back into the office space, they've got a lot of challenges on their hands. And now, sadly, we've added the Crocs challenge on top of it. So enough of my editorializing. And my apologies to anyone if I've offended you about your Crocs. Hey, power to you. So that does it for today's podcast. And I want to thank you for listening to the GSMC Business News Podcast on the GSMC Podcast Network. As always, please look at the place where you get your podcasts and choose to subscribe to this. And also, if you can, leave us some feedback or comments on either Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. Thank you for joining us today. Have a great day.
You've been listening to the GSMC Business News Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's podcast.